Continued from Part 1. If you're just joining, my name is Renee Callahan, and I'd spent 5 months quietly documenting my sister Dana's pattern of draining our dying mother's savings before our mother, on an ordinary Thursday evening in March, took my hand and asked me a question that told me she already half knew. I told my mother the truth that Thursday, but only the size of it, not the shape of it. I said, "I've noticed some things too, Mom. I'm looking into it. I don't want you to worry about the money. I want you to worry about feeling okay today. Let me carry this part." She nodded, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "You always carry everything," and I remember not knowing in that moment whether that sentence was a compliment or an accusation aimed at the whole family, including herself, for having let me. The weeks between. I want to tell you about the 2.5 weeks between that Thursday and the Saturday I found the envelope, because I don't want to skip over them just because nothing happened in them in the way a resealed envelope happening is a thing that happens. Those weeks were the quietest, hardest stretch of the whole spring, precisely because nothing was resolved and everything was known. I started sleeping badly, which for someone who has never in her adult life had trouble sleeping was its own small alarm bell. I'd lie awake running the numbers, not because I needed to recheck them. Patricia had already told me the documentation was sound, but because some part of me kept hoping, foolishly, that if I looked one more time a withdrawal would resolve itself into something innocent I'd simply misread. None of them ever did. I watched my mother in those weeks grow quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the cancer, and I understood, without either of us saying it directly again, that she was carrying the knowledge of what her younger daughter had done alongside the knowledge that she was dying, and that of the two, I'm not sure which one weighed on her more in any given hour. Dana, for her part, seemed to sense that something had shifted, though she never asked me directly what I knew. She became, if anything, more present in those weeks, more visits, more small gestures, bringing our mother a new robe, and sitting with her through an entire afternoon of an old movie neither of them had ever particularly liked. I want to be honest that some of what I felt watching that was suspicion, a fear that Dana was performing devotion the same way she'd once performed in need, managing the optics of the situation rather than reckoning with the substance of it. But I also want to be honest that some of what I felt was something closer to hope, the same stubborn, foolish hope I'd been carrying since the garage floor 12 years earlier, that maybe this, our mother's dying, would be the thing that finally cracked my sister open into someone who didn't need an audience to be kind. Both things turned out to be true in different measures at different moments, the way most things about people actually are, if you're willing to sit with the discomfort of not resolving them into a single verdict too early. I want to tell you what happened over the 6 weeks that followed, because it's the part of this story where I stopped being someone things happened to and became someone who did something about it, and it started, as these things often do, with an object I wasn't even looking for. The discovery. My mother had, since the previous autumn, kept a plain white envelope in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, marked in her own careful teacher's handwriting. "Funeral, do not touch." Inside it, she told me back in October, was $2,000 in cash, money she'd been setting aside in small increments for years. Separate from the main account, specifically so that whatever else happened with her savings, there would always be enough, guaranteed, sitting in a drawer to cover a casket and a modest service without anyone having to scramble or ask for help. She'd shown it to me once back when she was still strong enough to sit up in bed for long stretches, and she'd said, half joking, "This is the one thing in this house that is absolutely, positively not for emergencies. Not car repairs, not rent, not anybody's rough patch. This is for the end and only the end." On the second Saturday of April, I went looking for that envelope because the funeral home my mother had chosen years earlier in a pre-planning session with my father before he died needed a deposit to hold her preferred date and efficient, given how quickly hospice had told us things were now likely to move. I opened the nightstand drawer. The envelope was there, exactly where it always was, sealed, or what looked at a glance like sealed. But envelope glue, once broken and pressed back down, dries differently than glue that's never been opened. I'd spent 18 years handling other people's paperwork for a living. I know what a resealed envelope feels like under my thumb, the faint give of it, the way the flap doesn't quite lie flat. I opened it anyway, carefully, the way you'd open something you already suspected was going to hurt you. There was $650 inside, not $2,000. $650 in a mix of denominations that didn't match the neat stack my mother had shown me in October, smaller bills, wrinkled, the kind of cash that comes back to you as change rather than the kind you set aside deliberately. I sat on the edge of my mother's bed for a long time with that envelope in my hands. This is the moment I want to describe as precisely as I can, because it's different from everything that came before it. Every other withdrawal, I could tell myself, even after everything, even after the pattern was undeniable, that Dana had made a series of individually bad decisions under pressure, each one justified in the moment by whatever crisis was loudest that week. But this envelope wasn't an account Dana had access to by circumstance, the way the debit card had been handed to her almost accidentally, for convenience back in October. This envelope was in a locked bedroom in a nightstand drawer under a stack of my mother's reading glasses cases, deliberately hidden and deliberately labeled with the one sentence in the entire house that could not have been clearer. This is not for you, this is for the end, do not touch. Someone had gone looking for it. Someone had found it, opened it, taken $1,350 out of it, and then, this is the detail that still sits differently in my chest than any dollar figure ever could, carefully resealed the flap and put it back exactly where it belonged. So that unless someone happened to run a thumb along the seam on a random Saturday afternoon, it would have simply been there, the appearance of $2,000, right up until the day my mother actually died and someone opened it to find out it wasn't enough. I didn't cry. I want to say that not because I'm proud of not crying, but because I think it matters to how this story ends. I sat very still, the way I had in March at the kitchen table, and I understood with total clarity that I was no longer looking at a pattern of poor judgment. I was looking at premeditation. Somebody had planned for the gap not to be discovered until it was too late to matter, until my mother was gone, and grief and funeral arrangements and everyone's exhaustion would make it the easiest thing in the world to simply absorb a $1,350 shortfall rather than reopen a fight with a mother in the ground. I put the envelope back exactly as I'd found it. I photographed it first, the outside, the resealed flap, the contents laid out and counted on my mother's quilt, time-stamped on my phone at 2:47 p.m. on April 12th. Then, because I still needed the deposit for the funeral home regardless of what I just found, I drove there directly, cash in hand from my own account, and sat across from a funeral director named Louis Perrault while he walked me through the pre-planning file my parents had built years earlier. It was in that file, of all places, that I found the second piece of the discovery, the detail that turned a suspicious envelope into something closer to certainty. My parents had prepaid $1,800 of the total funeral cost back in 2019, a fact neither Dana nor I had known, tucked into a payment plan my father had quietly set up in the year before his own death, as though he'd been trying even then to make sure his wife's final arrangements could never be held hostage by anyone's financial trouble, including, I now understood, trouble he might have half suspected was coming from inside his own house. Louis mentioned it almost in passing, checking it off a list, and I sat very still in his office the same way I'd sat still on my mother's bed 20 minutes earlier, doing new math in my head. If $1,800 had already been paid toward the funeral in 2019, then the $2,000 in that envelope had never been the full cost of anything. It had been my mother's separate, private buffer, set aside on top of the prepaid amount, for a fear specific enough that she'd never mentioned it to either of us. The fear of the funeral home itself trying to upsell a grieving family into services they didn't need or couldn't afford. She'd been protecting us from being taken advantage of at the worst possible moment. And someone had reached into that exact protection and taken $1,350 out of it anyway. I didn't say any of that to Louis. I thanked him, paid the deposit from my own checking account, and asked him as evenly as I could manage to email me a copy of the original 2019 payment plan for my records. He did, 20 minutes later, time-stamped, itemized, a document that would end up as tab 4 in the binder I built over the following week. I drove home. I sat in my car in my own driveway for 11 minutes without going inside and called Patricia Ovadia for the second time. Before I called Patricia the second time, I did one more thing I haven't mentioned yet. I called my mother's bank directly, using the power of attorney documentation, and asked their fraud department, in the most neutral voice I could manage, what the formal process would look like if a family member wanted to flag a pattern of suspicious activity on an account without immediately freezing access for everyone. The representative, a patient man named Curtis, walked me through the options for almost 20 minutes and told me something I hadn't considered. That because Dana was listed only as an authorized user and not a joint owner, the bank could, at my request as POA, remove her card access entirely, effective immediately, without needing my mother's active participation in the moment, given her documented capacity limitations on any given day. I didn't do it that afternoon. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me still wasn't ready to make the situation that irreversible before I'd said a single word to my sister directly, and I've never fully decided, even now, whether that hesitation was wisdom or just one more habit of protecting Dana longer than the facts justified. I did ask Curtis to flag the account for enhanced monitoring, which meant that from that Saturday forward, every transaction over $50 would trigger a text alert to my phone within minutes. Nothing new came through on that alert before the confrontation, which I've never decided whether to read as evidence that Dana had on some level felt the walls closing in, or simply as evidence that I'd finally caught her at a moment when there was almost nothing left to take. The decision. I want to give this part real room because it was the hardest 6 days of that entire spring, harder in some ways than anything that came before or after, because it was the part where nobody outside my own head was making a single decision for me. I want to describe that first call in more detail than I have so far, because I think people imagine a moment like this as dramatic, a lawyer gasping, a plan snapping instantly into place, and it wasn't that at all. Patricia's voice on the phone was the same unhurried, procedural voice she'd used 2 years earlier walking a client through a commercial lease dispute. She asked me 3 questions before she said anything resembling advice. Whether I had documented power of attorney or only informal trust, whether my mother was currently deemed to have capacity by her medical team, and whether I had any reason to believe Dana might destroy or alter records if she suspected I was building a file. I answered all 3 as precisely as I could. Yes, documented in December. Yes, my mother's oncologist had confirmed capacity as recently as the previous week. And no, I didn't think Dana suspected anything yet, because Dana had never in 17 years imagined that I might be the one to finally check. Patricia's advice when I finally reached her was calm and specific in a way I found almost jarring against how I felt inside. She told me that what I was describing, a pattern of unauthorized withdrawals from an account where I held documented power of attorney, combined with what sounded like premeditated access to cash explicitly earmarked and off-limits, was, depending on how my mother wanted to handle it, potentially both a civil matter and, if my mother chose to pursue it, a criminal one under our state's elder financial exploitation statutes, which in our state carried real weight specifically because my mother was both over 65 and had a documented terminal diagnosis. She also told me something I hadn't expected, which was that I needed to slow down before I did anything else. Not because I was wrong about what had happened, but because being right and being able to prove it in a way nobody can talk their way around are 2 different projects. And I only had one chance to build the second one before grief made everyone, including me, less careful than they needed to be. So over the following week, at Patricia's direction, I did the thing I am, by training and temperament, better suited to than almost anyone I know. I built a case. I requested full statements going back 14 months from my mother's bank, which I was authorized to do under the power of attorney. I cross-referenced every withdrawal against a calendar I'd already half built out of medical appointments, medication logs, and my own work schedule, so that for nearly every questionable transaction I could show not just that money had moved, but where my mother had been, how she'd been feeling, and whether she was even physically capable of having authorized it in person. I printed the resealed envelope photos. I put it all in a black binder with tabs, the same way I build a due diligence file for a client selling a small business, because grief, I discovered, does not stop your hands from knowing how to do the one thing they've always known how to do. But the binder wasn't the hard part. The hard part happened at my own kitchen table 3 nights into that week when my husband Mark found me sitting in the dark with the binder closed in front of me, not working on it, just sitting. "You've had everything you need for 4 days," he said, not unkindly. "What's actually stopping you?" And I told him the truth, the real one, the one I hadn't said out loud to Patricia or to anyone else, because it embarrassed me to say it about myself at 43 years old. I was afraid that if I stopped being the daughter who quietly absorbed things, if I stopped being useful in the specific, silent, uncomplaining way I had been useful my entire life, I wouldn't know who I was to this family anymore. Being the reliable one had never felt like a role to me. It had felt like a fact about my character, the same as my height or the color of my eyes. But sitting at that table with the binder closed in front of me, I understood, maybe for the first time in my adult life, that reliable had never been a fact. It had been a job nobody had ever once paid me for, that I had never once been asked whether I wanted, and that I had somehow still built my entire sense of belonging around performing correctly. I called a coworker of mine, Dee Whitfield, a woman I'd done payroll work alongside for 9 years, who had gone through something similar with her own brother 2 years earlier, a much smaller version, a disputed $4,000 inheritance disagreement, but similar enough in shape that I trusted her read on it. Dee said something to me on the phone that I've thought about more times than I can count since. "Renee, you keep asking me if you're doing the right thing. You're not doing the right thing, you're doing the documented thing. Those aren't always the same question, and you've been treating them like they are your whole life." I sat with that for 2 more days. I thought about Dana at 10 years old, crying over a bicycle she didn't earn. I thought about her at 39, resealing an envelope with a steadiness that meant this wasn't the first time she'd done something like it. It was simply the first time I'd caught the seam. I thought about my mother, asleep most hours of most days now, who had spent 31 years teaching other people's children the difference between right and wrong, and had, without ever meaning to, taught her own 2 daughters 2 entirely different lessons about what love was allowed to cost. And underneath all of it, the fear stayed exactly the same size the whole time, no matter how much evidence I stacked against it. If I do this, if I finally stop absorbing, what if it turns out the only reason anyone in this family has ever wanted me around is that I never made them answer for anything? Between the call with Dee and the conversation with Mark, I also did something I'd never once done in 43 years, despite recommending it to 2 separate clients going through their own family crises. I sat in on a single session with a grief counselor named Renata Sa, who my mother's hospice program offered free of charge to family caregivers. I almost canceled it twice. I told myself I didn't have the hour to spare, which was true in the narrowest sense and a complete evasion in every sense that mattered. Renata didn't try to tell me what to do about Dana. She asked me one question that I still think about. "If your sister apologized perfectly right now, the exact words, the exact tone, everything you want to hear, would it change what you're planning to do?" I said no without having to think about it, and she said, "Then the plan was never really about getting an apology. It's about you finally getting to stop carrying something you were never supposed to be the only one carrying." That's allowed to be true even if she never says sorry at all. I didn't fully understand what she meant until much later, sitting in the confrontation itself, watching Dana's face while I read the numbers out loud. Because by then I realized I genuinely wasn't watching for her reaction anymore. I was simply telling the truth out loud for the first time in my life, without waiting to see whether it would be received well before I decided it was worth saying. I didn't get a tidy resolution to that fear. I want to be honest about that, because I think the tidy version, where the protagonist has a single epiphany and the fear simply lifts, isn't true to how this kind of thing actually works. What happened instead was smaller and more useful. On the 6th night, sitting with Maya while she did her homework at the same kitchen table, she looked up out of nowhere and said, "Mom, why do you always say sorry when Aunt Dana's the one who's late?" I laughed, surprised, and started to explain it away. The way I'd explained away 100 smaller versions of the same question over the years, and then I stopped myself mid-sentence, because I realized I didn't actually have an answer that would sound reasonable coming out loud in front of my own daughter, the way it had always sounded reasonable inside my own head. That was the moment the fear didn't disappear but got outweighed. I understood, watching my 9-year-old wait for an answer I didn't have, that whatever role I'd been performing for this family for 39 years, I did not want her learning it from watching me. I called Patricia the next morning and told her I was ready. I also want to describe the moment I told Mark my full plan, not just the fact of it, because his reaction taught me something about my own family I hadn't been able to see from inside it. When I walked him through the binder tab by tab, he was quiet for a long time and then he said, "Renee, if this were a client of yours, not your sister, a client, what would you tell them to do?" I said I'd tell them to present the documentation calmly, request restitution on a reasonable timeline, and let the other party's reaction tell them how much of the relationship was worth salvaging afterward. Mark said, "So do that. The only reason you're hesitating is that you've decided your sister gets a different standard of accountability than a stranger would, and I think you've been deciding that your whole life without ever once asking yourself why." I didn't have a good answer for him that night either. I don't know that I fully have one now. What I have instead is a suspicion that the different standard was never really about Dana at all. It was about my own fear that holding her to the same standard I'd hold anyone else to would somehow prove that I'd never really been her sister in the first place, just her accountant, and that the two things had gotten so tangled inside me over 39 years that I could no longer easily tell them apart. There was one more conversation before the confrontation itself that I want to include, because it's the one that clarified for me exactly what I was and wasn't trying to accomplish. Patricia asked me directly in our final planning call what outcome I actually wanted: full repayment, a police report, a rewritten will, a full and final break with my sister. I remember sitting with the question longer than I expected to. What I finally told her was that I didn't want Dana punished so much as I wanted Dana seen, accurately, completely, with the pattern named out loud in front of the one person whose good opinion Dana had spent her whole life performing for. I wanted my mother to get to spend whatever time she had left without carrying a secret that wasn't hers to carry alone. And I wanted, for the first time in my life, to say a true thing to my sister without softening it first to make it easier for her to swallow. Patricia said that was, in her professional opinion, a completely reasonable goal and also the hardest one of the four options I'd listed, because unlike a police report or a will amendment, being seen accurately isn't something you can force onto another person. All you can do, she said, is put the truth on the table clearly enough that nobody in the room can honestly pretend not to have seen it. What they do with that afterward was never going to be mine to control. That distinction between telling the truth and controlling what happens to it once it's told is the thing I had to make peace with before I ever sat down at that kitchen table again. The confrontation. We held it at my mother's house on the third Sunday of April at the same kitchen table where I'd first opened that laptop in March, a detail I chose deliberately at Patricia's suggestion because a location my mother felt safe in mattered more, at that point, than any instinct I had to stage this somewhere with more distance. My mother, by then, was having good days and bad days in roughly equal measure, and this happened to fall on a good one: alert, sitting up, dressed in the cardigan she liked, present for every minute of it in a way I will always be grateful for, because it meant she got to hear the truth from me instead of finding it out later, secondhand, after she was gone. I told Dana I needed to talk to her and Mom together about logistics with the accounts, which was true, if incomplete. She showed up expecting, I think, a conversation about hospice billing. She did not know about the binder sitting closed on the table until I opened it. I made tea before Dana arrived, which is a strange, small detail to remember about a day like that, but I remember it clearly. I stood at my mother's stove making 3 cups of the same chamomile blend she'd always kept in the cabinet above the toaster, because some part of me needed my hands to be doing something ordinary in the minutes before I did something that wasn't. My mother sat at the table already, in her cardigan, the binder closed in front of the seat I'd be taking, and she watched me move around her kitchen the way she must have watched both of us move around it 1,000 times across 40 years. And she said quietly, before Dana's car even pulled into the driveway, "Whatever happens in the next hour, I want you to know I'm proud of how you're doing this. Not just what you found, how you're choosing to say it." I didn't trust myself to answer that out loud, so I just nodded and set her tea down in front of her and sat down across from the seat that would soon be my sister's. I want to describe what I actually said because Patricia had helped me plan it, sentence by sentence, specifically so that I would not, in the moment, reach for anger, which I understood by then was the one tool that would let Dana turn this into a fight about my tone instead of a reckoning with the facts. I laid the printed statements out first, then the medication and appointment calendar beside them, then the photographs of the envelope in that order, and I said calmly, the way I'd say it to any client whose books didn't reconcile. Over the last 5 months, $16,660 has left Mom's accounts and transactions I can't match to her care, her groceries, or anything she authorized while lucid. On February 14th, the week we were told to consider hospice, $1,600 came out and showed up 3 days later at a resort in Sedona. And 2 weeks ago, I found Mom's funeral envelope resealed with $1,350 missing from inside it. Dana's reaction was immediate and, I'll admit, exactly what I'd expected because I had watched this exact pattern play out over smaller sums for 17 years. She got loud. She said I had always looked for a reason to make her the villain. She said I didn't understand what it was like to actually be here every day instead of hiding behind a laptop. She turned to our mother, eyes filling, voice cracking exactly on cue, and said, "Mom, you know I would never." And my mother, who had not said a single word since I opened the binder, held up one hand, the same steady, quiet gesture she used to use to settle a classroom of 7-year-olds, and said, "Dana, I saw the envelope. I check on it sometimes at night when I can't sleep." I knew before Renee said anything. I have never, in 39 years of watching my sister perform distress, seen her go as silent as she went in that moment. There was a second wave after that, there always is, where Dana pivoted from denial to a kind of wounded self-justification I recognized instantly, because I'd heard fragments of it my whole life and was finally hearing the whole architecture of it laid out at once, that she'd always been treated like the family's cautionary tale. That being the strong one's sister meant nobody ever checked on whether she was drowning, that she'd taken the money, yes, some of it, not all of what the numbers said, but some, because she genuinely believed in the moment that she'd pay it back before anyone needed it, the way she'd always half believed that about every debt she'd ever left unpaid in our family for 2 decades. And here is the one moment of real vulnerability I want to give her credit for because it would be dishonest to leave it out. At the very end, after the anger burned down, Dana put her face in her hands and said, quietly, not performing anymore, in a voice I hadn't heard from her since we were girls, "I don't know how to stop needing to be the one everyone worries about. I don't know who I am if I'm not that." And for 1 second, I felt the same thing I'd felt on the garage floor 12 years earlier, the pull toward the sister I'd always hoped was underneath the performance. But I had learned something that spring that I hadn't known on that garage floor, that understanding where someone's behavior comes from is not the same thing as excusing what it costs the people around them, and that I was allowed to hold both truths without letting the first one erase the second. Before that, there was a stretch of maybe 10 minutes where Dana tried several different versions of the same defense, each one slightly recalibrated based on which part of the room seemed to be landing. To me, she said, "You've been waiting for a reason to do this to me since we were kids." To our mother, she said, "I would have paid it all back, Mom. You know I always figure it out eventually." When neither of those landed the way she needed them to, she tried a version aimed at both of us at once. "Fine. Fine, you want to make me the villain of Mom's last few months. Is that really what you both need right now?" A sentence I recognized instantly, even in the moment, as the exact shape of the line she'd used at Thanksgiving in 2021, the one about performing need as a job. She was, without seeming to notice it herself, describing her own pattern back to us as though it were an accusation against me instead of a confession about herself. I didn't raise my voice at any point, which I know because Patricia had asked me gently whether I wanted to record the conversation for my own protection, and I declined, telling her I trusted myself to stay measured without needing proof of it after the fact. A decision I still stand by, even though it means this part of the story rests on my memory rather than a transcript. What I said instead of matching her volume was, "I'm not trying to make you the villain of anything, Dana. I'm trying to make sure Mom doesn't spend whatever time she has left carrying a secret by herself, and I'm trying to make sure that whatever happens between us after this, at least one conversation in this family finally happened with the actual numbers on the table instead of just a feeling." That's when Dana put her face in her hands. I said the line then that I'd rehearsed with Patricia, the only rehearsed sentence in the entire conversation because I wanted to get it exactly right. "Dana, I believe that you're in pain. I don't believe pain gives anyone the right to spend our mother's death like it's a resource. Needing to be needed isn't a free pass, it's just the explanation. It's not the excuse." Nobody said anything for a long moment after that. My mother reached across the table, not toward Dana but toward me, and took my hand and said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "Thank you for not doing this the way I would have let you get away with never doing it at all." Then she did something I hadn't planned for and Patricia hadn't prepared me for either. She turned to Dana and asked her directly, plainly, the way she used to ask a second grader why they'd taken something off another child's desk. "Why didn't you just ask me? I would have given you money if you'd asked me honestly, Dana. I gave you money your whole life when you asked. Why did you have to take it instead?" Dana didn't have an answer for that. I watched her try to find one. I watched her mouth open the way mine had opened at 22 in a lecture hall, if I can borrow an image from somewhere far outside this story. And I watched nothing come out that resembled a real answer, because I don't think even now that she has fully worked out the answer for herself. My best guess, and it is only a guess, is that asking would have meant admitting she needed it plainly without the emotional cover of a crisis to justify it, and that some part of my sister had learned, decades before any of us were sitting at that table, that a plain, uncushioned request was the one thing in this family less safe to make than a quiet theft dressed up as an emergency. Before anyone stood up from that table, my mother said one more thing I want to include exactly as she said it, because it's become in the months since the sentence I returned to more than my own rehearsed line. She looked at both of us, not just Dana, both of us, and said, "I raised you to believe love meant never asking each other for anything because I thought that was generosity. I think now it was just fear, mine, dressed up as a lesson. I'm sorry for that part. I don't think either of you learned how to ask for what you needed honestly, and I think that's on me and your father as much as it's on either of you." Neither Dana nor I had an answer for that either. We sat with it, all three of us, in a kitchen that had watched every important conversation in our family's history happen at that same table, while the tea went cold in front of all three untouched cups. Aftermath. My mother passed away 6 weeks later at home with hospice care on a Tuesday morning in early June, with me on one side of the bed and, at her specific request, Dana on the other. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters to how this story should actually end. My mother did not disown my sister. She did not rewrite her will, though Patricia had told her she was entitled to. What she did instead, in the weeks between the confrontation and her death, was ask Dana to pay back $6,000 of the missing money in monthly installments to me directly, as executor, to be used first for outstanding funeral costs and then split between us as originally planned in her will, a compromise. My mother told me privately that was not about the money being made whole because it never really can be. It's about your sister having to keep a promise to someone out loud for once in her life and see it through. I'm not going to tell you Dana has kept that promise perfectly. She has made 4 of the 12 payments so far on time and missed one, which she made up 2 weeks late with an apology that was, for the first time I can remember, not accompanied by a justification. That's not redemption. I want to be honest about that too. One apology without an attached excuse doesn't undo 17 years of pattern, and I don't expect it to. Dana and I speak now, but carefully, at a distance that is new for us and that I think for now is the correct distance. We are not the sisters we might have been if 100 small moments in our childhood had gone differently. I don't know if we ever will be. That thread is still loose, and I'm not going to pretend for the sake of a tidier story that it isn't. I learned something about Dana's own circumstances in the weeks after the confrontation that I want to include here, even though it complicates the story rather than resolving it, because I think a story this specific owes you the complication instead of a clean villain to close the book on. Dana had, it turned out, been quietly behind on her own rent for 4 months by the time our mother's diagnosis came down, a fact she'd never told our mother or me or apparently anyone, because admitting it would have broken the performance she'd built her entire adult identity around, the one where she was struggling in ways that were visible and forgivable rather than ways that felt to her like proof she'd failed at the one thing she was supposed to be good at, which was being taken care of. I don't say that to excuse the resealed envelope. I say it because I think it's the closest I've ever come to understanding my sister without either romanticizing her or reducing her to a single simple motive. She wasn't a mastermind. She was someone who had spent 39 years learning that her own honest needs were less lovable than her performed ones, and who reached when the stakes got as high as they get, for the only tool that story had ever taught her how to use. When I finally told her the full story a few weeks after the funeral, over coffee at the diner I do the books for, listened all the way through without interrupting once, and then said, "You know, the thing that gets me isn't even the money. It's that you spent 5 months protecting your sister's reputation with your own mother, right up until the exact minute you couldn't anymore. I hadn't thought of it in those terms before she said it, but she was right, and it stuck with me that a large part of what I'd actually been doing. All those months of silent screenshots was giving Dana every possible chance to correct course before anyone else had to know, a kindness I'm not sure she ever fully understood I was extending, and one I'm honestly not sure, looking back, that she'd earned. The funeral itself was smaller than my mother had once pictured, though it was, in the end, fully paid for, the resealed envelope's shortfall covered quietly by the first 2 of Dana's 12 payments, arriving faster than the schedule technically required, a detail I noticed and chose not to make a point of out loud. Harold gave a short, unpolished eulogy about the woman 2 doors down who used to leave her porch light on for him after his wife died, so I'd know somebody in the world still noticed whether I made it home. Dana sat in the front row beside me, not behind me or across from me, which felt at the time like the only concrete evidence I had that something between us had actually shifted rather than simply gone quiet. I've had more than one conversation since then with people in my own life, Mark, even Patricia once over coffee, months after the case was formally closed, where I've been asked some version of the same question. Do I think Dana has really changed, or has she simply learned to perform accountability now instead of performing need, the same instinct wearing a more convincing costume? I don't have a clean answer to that. What I have instead is a policy I've adopted, one I didn't have access to during the 17 years before that spring. I no longer extend trust based on how convincingly someone performs remorse. I extend it based on a track record, built slowly, transaction by transaction, the same way I've built every other kind of trust in my professional life for 18 years. Dana is, as of this recording, 7 payments into that track record. I genuinely don't know how the rest of it will go. I've made peace with not knowing, which is a different and, I think, healthier thing than pretending I already do. What I will tell you is this. Harold, our mother's old neighbor, still comes by my house sometimes with soup he still can't season correctly because he says he got used to having someone to bring it to and doesn't see a reason to stop just because the address changed. And Maya, who is 10 now, asked me a few months after the funeral whether Aunt Dana was still figuring out how to be brave in the right way. A sentence she'd clearly built out of some half-overheard version of what happened, said with the plain, unguarded clarity kids have before the world teaches them to soften things. I told her yes, I thought that was exactly right, and I told her that being brave in the right way sometimes means telling the truth quietly, with proof, instead of loudly with anger, and that I hoped, whatever she ended up needing to be brave about someday, she'd remember it doesn't have to be dramatic to count. The will itself was read, informally, at Patricia's office 3 weeks after the funeral. Nothing dramatic, no surprises, because my mother had made every material decision about it herself, in full possession of the facts, in the weeks after the confrontation. The house sale proceeds were split evenly between Dana and me, exactly as the original will had always specified, minus the $6,000 restitution routed through me first. My mother had added one handwritten note to the file, which Patricia read aloud at the end in her own words, dated the week before she died. I am not asking my daughters to forgive each other on any particular schedule. I am asking them to tell each other the truth for the rest of however long they both get. Because a family that can't do that isn't actually resting on love, it's resting on everyone agreeing not to look too closely. And I have had enough in my own life of not looking too closely. I don't think either Dana or I fully understood, sitting in that office, how much that one sentence was going to end up shaping the next several years of however we managed to be sisters going forward. I think we're both still finding out. There's a small scene from 4 months after the funeral I want to close this part of the story with, because it's the moment that told me more than any repayment or any apology that something real had shifted. Maya had a school project due, a family tree assignment, the kind every kid does at some point, index cards and yarn connecting names across a poster board, and she asked, unprompted, if she could call Aunt Dana to ask what our grandmother had been like as a little girl, since Dana apparently remembered our mother telling stories from her own childhood that I'd never heard. I said of course. I sat in the next room, not eavesdropping exactly, but close enough to hear the shape of it, and I heard my sister's voice, unhurried, warm in a way that had nothing to do with an audience. telling my daughter about a woman neither of us gets to ask new questions of anymore. At one point, Maya laughed at something, a real laugh, and I heard Dana laugh back. And for about 4 minutes, listening through a wall, I let myself believe that whatever else remains broken between my sister and me, this, a niece who gets to know her aunt as someone worth listening to, not just someone to worry about, might be the one thing out of that whole terrible spring that actually turned out all right. That, I think, is the real inheritance out of all of this, not the $6,000, not the house, not even the resolution with my sister, which remains unfinished and might stay that way. It's a 10-year-old girl who no longer has to watch her mother apologize automatically for someone else's lateness, because her mother finally stopped doing it in front of her. And it's a phone call 4 months after a funeral, where for 4 minutes, nobody in my family needed rescuing from anything at all. I think about that sentence I told myself back in March, the one I promised I'd carry all the way through this story. Love that never has to answer for itself isn't love. It's just an unpaid invoice wearing a family photo. I believe that more now than I did the day I first thought it, sitting at that kitchen table with a laptop and a balance that didn't add up. Love that's real can survive being asked to account for itself. It's only the other kind, the kind that runs on someone else's silence, that can't. I think too about the machinery I kept naming throughout this story, the quiet family arithmetic that decided, before either my sister or I could talk, which one of us got to need things and which one of us got to be needed by. I don't think that machinery is unique to my family. I think most families run some version of it quietly for generations, and most of the people inside it never get handed a reason clear enough to look at it directly. I got handed a spreadsheet. I'm not grateful for the reason. I am, strange as it sounds to say out loud, grateful for what looking finally taught me about my sister, about my mother, and mostly, if I'm honest, about the parts of my own life I'd spent 39 years mistaking for a personality instead of recognizing as a role I'd simply never been asked whether I wanted to keep playing. I don't know how to end a story like this one in a way that resolves cleanly, and I've come to believe that's the most honest thing I can tell you about it. My sister and I are not enemies. We are not yet, and may never again be, what we once were on a garage floor at 31, believing for one unguarded minute that we finally understood each other. We are two women who grew up in the same house under two very different sets of instructions, who loved the same mother in two different registers, and who are still, slowly, awkwardly, figuring out what it looks like to tell each other the truth without either one of us needing to perform anything in order to be believed. Some days that feels like real progress. Some days it just feels like two people being careful around a wound that hasn't finished healing. I suspect, honestly, that it will always be some combination of both, and I've stopped needing it to be simpler than that in order to call it enough. If any part of this found you where you actually live, if you've ever been the one who kept the peace by keeping quiet, or the one whose reliability got treated as a resource instead of a relationship, I'd genuinely love to hear your version of it in the comments. Sharing this video with someone who'd understand it helps this channel more than you probably know, and if you're new here, I hope you'll stay and subscribe because there are more stories like this one still to tell. Thank you for sitting with mine all the way to the end.